Today's lecture is going to focus on neural and hormonal systems. We're going to learn about how neurons communicate in a rather fast form of communication. We're also going to learn about how your body sends chemicals through the bloodstream. These chemicals are known as hormones, and they're a slow form of communication. So let's start with the neuron. The neuron is sort of like the way that your body sends information from one part of the body to the next. It's how your brain communicates with your muscles in your body to tell them to move. It's how your fingertips relay sensation back about the temperature that's outside or the pressure that your finger is feeling at the moment. So neurons are essentially little information centers, and they send information from one end of the neuron to the end of the neuron. And that's how they communicate. They just tap each other on the shoulder and say, hey, here's a message. And they keep sending those messages down until it reaches the part of the body that can use that information. So the really interesting thing about neurons is that, by and large, they're pretty similar no matter where you go. Each type of neuron is present in pretty much every species out there that is more developed than an amoeba, something that has, definitely mammals have all of these neurons. And we can learn a lot about the different types of neurons and how they interact by working with species like rats. So I've mentioned before my friend that works with rats all day. Part of what she does is slicing the brains and looking at the scans of the neurons. And we can actually learn a lot about the processes that are happening in our own brain without having to use a human brain, which frankly we can't use in the same way that we can with a rat, because we can sacrifice the rat and then take the information right there when the brain is still young and able to give us some really valuable information. So the basic format of a neuron is, its shape is it's almost like a mace. It's got a shape where it's got this big cell body up here. And it contains the nucleus, and the nucleus is one of the things that controls, the development of the cell. So the cell body, is one of the things that nourishes the cell, and it contains all of the information needed to sustain the cell. On the outer rim of this cell body are what we call the dendrites. So the dendrites are basically little feelers. They put their feelers out and they connect with other neurons. They connect with the axon terminals of other neurons. So if two neurons are related, basically what you're going to have is you're going to have this neuron hanging out right here. And then just imagine taking this cell body and planting it over here. And that's what it looks like. It's just a connection from the dendrites to the axons. So if the dendrites put the feelers out to receive information, then the axon terminals send the information. Now, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has to actually travel down this line right here to get to the axon terminal. So the information will be taken in by the dendrites, funneled down through this long tube, which is known as the axon, and it'll come out the end to the axon terminals. And on the axon terminals, those are connected to dendrites, and the process just goes on and on. So the axon has a lot of moving parts to it. It has a lot of bits that make it function as well as it does. So first we've got, on the inside, we've got the axon. The cells outside of it create what's known as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is basically a fatty layer of insulation that provides greater transmission, reduced signal loss, and it basically makes the neuron work better and faster. Now, there are these gaps between little clumps of myelin sheathing. These gaps are known as nodes of Ranvier. So a node of Ranvier is basically a repeating center. The way that these electrical impulses work is through exchange of ions. So when these little parts of the axon are not sheathed by the insulation layer, they're exposed to the elements and can readily exchange ions. And so it acts as a repeater. So the signal gets sent this far, and then it gets a boost. It gets resent, and then again. So you wind up with no signal loss from this point all the way down to the axon terminals. And then lastly, we have the Schwann cells, which are what make the myelin happen. Now, the way that the neuron communicates is really interesting. You've got a neuron up here, we'll call it the sending neuron, and it sends what's known as an action potential down. See all these little nodes of Ranvier, they repeat the signal, and they bring it down the axon to the axon terminals. These terminals connect with the dendrites of a receiving neuron. Now, what's going on here is what's really interesting. First of all, these little neurons are actually not touching. The axon terminal never touches the dendrite. It's separated by what's known as the synaptic gap. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the synapse in a little bit. So the way that the signal gets sent is there's first what's known as an action potential. So that's when the signal gets sent from one neuron down to the next. Now, the neurons generate electricity from chemical events which create charged atoms, which are known as ions. And the inside of the axon is negatively charged. Outside the axon is positively charged. So what happens is when the signal occurs, the positively charged sodium pours inside the axon. This is known as depolarization. So you can see right here on this chart, right, there's a threshold moment where it hits it and then it begins to depolarize. And the sodium floods in to make this happen. Then the sodium gates open again and it comes out. And this is known as repolarization. It'll hit a final moment where it rests, it gets the refractory moment where it can't fire again just yet. And so it'll make sure to push out all those extra sodium ions so that it's at rest again, when it can then become activated by the stimulus again. Now all this happens in a very short period of time. Like you can't count how fast it is because it's just that fast. So these rest periods are really very minuscule. Now, a neuron knows whether or not to send a signal based on whether or not the threshold has been reached. So here's a rather clinical definition for you. Each neuron receives depolarizing and hyperpolarizing currents from many neurons. When the depolarizing current, positive ions, minus the hyperpolarizing current, negative ions, exceed minimum intensity, or threshold, the neuron fires an action potential. That's a really long definition. Basically, what the threshold means is that's when there's enough intensity for the neuron to fire. So based on what you've got coming into the neuron, whether you've got signals saying that you should excite this neuron, and then you've got other signals saying, oh, you shouldn't, you should inhibit this neuron. So once the level is reached where the go ahead and excite it exceeds the inhibit it, then you hit the threshold and the neuron fires. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the refractory period, and that's just a brief period of time after the neuron has fired where it can't fire again, so it has to recharge. Part of the way it does this is with what's known as sodium-potassium pumps. Sodium-potassium pumps pump positive ions out from the inside of the neuron and make them ready for that new action potential. So that's what's going on in the refractory period, is they're pushing out the sodium. They're getting rid of everything that's making it more positive, because remember that axon is generally negative. The thing, though, about neurons is that the signal remains the same. In other words, it has an all or none response. So the neuron doesn't send a weak signal. It either sends the signal or it doesn't send the signal. So the intensity of that action potential remains the same. Part of the reason for that is because that myelin sheathing, which insulates and repeats the information, and it carries the neurotransmitter information down from one end of the neuron to the other. So there's no in between, there's no halfway. It's either all or it's none. Now the communication between the neurons takes place at what's known as the synapse. The synapse is an area where the axon and the dendrite meet but do not touch. So what you'll see is we've got the axon terminal right here pushing out neurotransmitter information. It's sending its signal along to the dendrite. The dendrite has all of these little receptors right here. And if the neurotransmitter fits, it will connect with the dendrite. And if it reaches the threshold required to send that signal, it will then send the signal on down to its axons, which are connected to other neurons, which will then pass the signal on and on. So here's sort of a better description of how the neurotransmitters work. The neurotransmitter forms up here in the vesicles. So it gets the information from out here as to what neurotransmitter needs to be sent down. And it will transport the neurotransmitter down the axon using those myelin sheathing gaps, the nodes of Ranvier, to speed the signal on, and it will get down to the bottom. Once it gets to the bottom, the calcium enters, which releases those neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters then attach to receptors on new neurons. They break off. Some of them are taken back up, and then it's transported back to the cell body for use later. So this is the way that your neuron works. It generates the information, carries it down, releases it, brings some back up, and goes back to the start. Now, one of the things that we look at a lot, especially in drug development, is different types of neurotransmitters and how we can mimic them with what are known as agonists and antagonists. So we have a neurotransmitter, and if you think about it like a lock and key, you see that we've got these three segments. You've got a box, and a triangle. And that's the necessary component for this neurotransmitter to fire perfectly. So an agonist excites much in the same way as the original neurotransmitter would. It doesn't block the information, it still sends on the signal. And so we see that it acts much the same way. For example, morphine acts as an agonist for something like the endogenous opiates that we have in our brain. Antagonists, on the other hand, fit the molecule in such a way that it's similar to the neurotransmitter, but not strong enough, not similar enough to stimulate the receptor on the other end. So it does not send the neurotransmitter onward, it blocks it. So it fits just enough to say, I'm going to shut you down. So that's how the neurons communicate with one another. But then there's a whole lot more to the neural system than just the communication between two neurons that are connected at the synapse. We also look at two different parts of the overall nervous system. So we've got the central nervous system, which is what you see here in red. It's the brain and the spinal cord. And then you've got the peripheral nervous system, which is here in yellow. And that's what takes care of pretty much everything else. So we're going to break down these two different components and learn a little bit more about the nervous system. So the nervous system is what all of the nerve cells are part of. And it's one of the most, well, it's the speediest form of communication in your body. And the central nervous system is just that core component. It's just the main things that keep you alive. You know, your spinal cord can often cause motion before the brain can. So those are the two core components that keep you alive. The peripheral nervous system is the sensory information, the motor information that gives us the ability to do things like to sense whether or not something is warm, or to tell the difference between sandpaper and fur. So those are the sensory and the motor, and to know to pull your hand away from heat, motor. So that's the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is pretty simple, but the peripheral nervous system can be broken down into two different ways that make it a little bit more complex. First, we have the peripheral nervous system that breaks down into autonomic and somatic. So somatic is very simple. It's basically the voluntary movements of your muscles, your skeletal muscles. So we're not talking about the smooth muscles that digest your food. We're talking about your leg muscles and your arm muscles. So that's relatively simple. That doesn't break down any farther. But autonomic is stuff that happens self-regulated. It's the internal organs and glands, the things that you don't consciously make the decision to act on. Now that can be broken down into two distinct pathways as well. The sympathetic, which is the arousing form, and the parasympathetic, which is the calming form. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. So if we've got these neurons that I showed you earlier, those are a great example of a motor neuron, which is what we've got down here. Now we've got a lot of different neurons that exist throughout the body. So we've got these interneurons, which connect between multiple neurons. So it might connect a sensory neuron to a motor neuron. So this would be the type of communication where the sensory neuron picks up information that says, hey, your hand is close to something really hot. And that will then connect through an interneuron down to the motor neuron that moves the hand away. So that's the way that these types of neurons communicate. And they're supported by glial cells. So there are a number of different types of glial cells. We already spoke about Schwann cells, which insulate the axon of the neuron through the myelin sheathing. But there's also the astrocytes, which provide nutrition to the neurons, and then oligodendrocytes do the same thing in large part as the Schwann cells do, insulating the neurons. So as I said before, the peripheral nervous system can be broken down into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is simply the muscles, the skeletal muscles that control your ability to walk around, pick things up, basically all of your muscles that you're able to consciously control. Autonomic, on the other hand, is the part of the peripheral nervous system that is entirely automated. It's all of the glands and muscles internally that do all the things that they need to do to keep you alive without you ever having to think about it. You know, your stomach digesting food, things of that nature. Now, the autonomic nervous system can be broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the sympathetic is the one that mobilizes you in stressful situations. That's what's going to enable fight or flight. That's essentially what's going to get you the hell out of Dodge if the zombies are coming. The parasympathetic, on the other hand, is what calms the body and conserves energy. So the best way to differentiate between these two is to think the parasympathetic is like a parachute because it slows you down. So these are some examples of what's controlled by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of, it's essentially the opposites from one another. So constriction or dilation of pupils, stimulating the tear glands or not, but, you know, inhibiting heart rate, you know, accelerating the heart rate. So those are the different ways that these complement one another. So there's always going to be something on the other side. The sympathetic has its partner in the parasympathetic. Now, after all of the different types of ways of looking at the nervous system, we move on now to the endocrine system. So this is the hormonal communication chapter portion. And this is the slow communication, and this is because the hormones are generated in one of these many glands, and then dumped out into the bloodstream. Now, the bloodstream operates pretty darn quickly, but it's not as fast as neural communication. Remember, neural communication is what's going to tell you to move your hand away from something that's instantly too hot. That's something that's very fast. If we waited for that message to be sent through the blood, you would have a burned hand. So it's still very fast communication, but much slower than neural communication. Now, hormones are, in their very nature, synthesized in one area of the body and utilized in one or many other areas of the body. And so it does this by passing through the bloodstream and operating in many different ways. For example, things like epinephrine, which is what's in an EpiPen. It's adrenaline. It increases that heart rate and the blood pressure and the blood sugar really quickly, and it gives you the feeling of excitement during emergency situations. So that's one of the things that you might, adrenaline rush, like when you trip over something really quick. Adrenaline pumps out, and you feel that really quickly, just not as quickly as you would if it was a neural impulse. One of the most important glands, one of the most important creators of hormones, is the pituitary gland. And that's because it's considered the master gland. It actually regulates the other glands throughout the body. So the pituitary gland not only has its own hormones that it generates, but those hormones serve the function of telling other glands throughout the body what they need to do. The thyroid and parathyroid basically help to regulate metabolic and calcium rate. So people that have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism might have to take medication to help regulate their thyroid glands. The adrenal glands I mentioned earlier, they're something that secretes a very fast hormone during stress and emotional situations. And so these can lead to increased heart rate and blood sugar, which can mobilize you in a situation that might be threatening. It can also create anxiety in situations that aren't really all that threatening, but your body perceives them to be threatening. And lastly are the gonads. So all of the glands that I've spoken about before are shared by the genders. But when it comes to the gonads, the sex glands are different in males and females and differently located. So they regulate bodily development and they maintain the reproductive organs in the adult. So when a man has his testosterone, it's generated in the testes. The estrogens are generated up in the ovaries. And what these do is they not only develop the ability for you to procreate by sending out your genetic material in the form of an egg or a sperm, but they also help to develop your body's physical form. So the estrogens are going to help in breast development and hip widening, and the testes are going to assist in muscle development. And so what you'll see is that this is part of why they do hormone replacement therapy for individuals that are going to go through a sex change, is because if they take the hormone for the gender that they feel that they are, then it's going to help to develop some of these changes. For a man turning into a woman, it might help develop the breasts and change the shape of the hips. So hormones are a really interesting but slower form of communication when compared to neurons. That's all we have for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to ask me any questions, and see you again next time.